The first night Marlene Cobb slept at Bellhaven Farm, she woke at 2:47 a.m. to a glow crawling across her bedroom ceiling, soft blue-white, pulsing like a heartbeat through fog. For one groggy second, she thought it was headlights sweeping the wall. Then she remembered. There was no road close enough for that. The nearest highway was 4 miles down the mountain, and her nearest neighbor's porch light was a mile in the other direction, blocked by a stand of black walnut trees. She sat up. The glow was coming through the window, from the fields. Marlene told herself it was swamp gas, ball lightning, something with a name, because she was 39 years old and had just spent 11 months in a divorce mediator's office, learning that the version of her life she'd trusted for 14 years had been a kind of ghost story too. A thing everyone around her had quietly known wasn't real. While she went on decorating rooms for it, she was done being afraid of things in the dark. She'd survived the actual monster. A light in a field wasn't going to run her off. So she got up, pulled on the barn coat still smelling of the previous owner's dog, and walked out onto the porch to look. That was the night she started keeping a notebook. 6 weeks earlier, Marlene had been sitting in a rental apartment in Charleston with a laptop, 3 glasses of wine deep into a real estate listing site, telling herself she was just looking. She'd typed cheap farmland West Virginia into the search bar the way other newly single women her age typed pottery classes near me, or how to get back into running. She wanted something that was entirely, unambiguously hers, something Richard had never touched, never co-signed, never helped her pick out while making the actual decision himself. The listing that stopped her scrolling was 214 acres in Pocahontas County, a farmhouse built in 1911, a barn, 2 outbuildings, road frontage, mineral rights included, and a price so far below comparable listings in the county that she assumed it was a typo. It wasn't. She called the agent, a soft-spoken man named Dale Pruitt, who represented about half the real estate in 3 counties, and asked him point-blank why it was so cheap. There was a pause on the line, just a beat too long. "It's a fine piece of ground," he said. "Real fine soil, good water. It's just, well, folks around here call it the Bellhaven place. There's stories." "What kind of stories?" "Lights," he said. "Over the back fields, mostly the low pasture down by the creek. Been going on long as anybody remembers. My granddad used to talk about it, and his granddad before him. Some folks say it's spirits. Some say it's the ghost of Eli Bellhaven himself, still walking his land. It's kept the place from selling for going on 6 years now. Last family that bought it, the Trenholms, lasted 8 months before they put it back on the market. Workers won't hardly go out in those fields after dark. I'll be honest with you, because I'd rather you hear it from me than from a neighbor." Marlene should have felt a chill. Instead, she felt something closer to recognition. The specific electric feeling of finding the one thing everyone else was too spooked to want. "I'll come look at it Saturday," she said. Dale met her at the end of a gravel drive that switchbacked up through hemlocks so old their lower branches had gone bare and gray, like the trees had given up on themselves halfway up. The farmhouse sat on a shoulder of land with a view down into a long, shallow bowl of pasture that ran maybe half a mile to a tree-lined creek. Beyond the creek, the land climbed again into forested ridges, blue-green and endless, the kind of view real estate photos never quite capture, because the human eye does something with distance that a camera doesn't. The house itself was tired but sound. Sagging porch boards, a wood stove that needed a new gasket, kitchen wallpaper peeling in long curls like it was trying to leave too. But the bones were good. Post and beam barn framing, a hand-dug stone-lined well, A root cellar dug into the hillside that stayed a constant 52 degrees. Marlene walked every room twice. "Tell me about the lights," she said finally, standing at the kitchen window looking down at the low pasture. Dale rubbed the back of his neck. Nobody's ever gotten hurt by them if that's what you're asking. They just show up. Bluish, sometimes more white. Move slow, low to the ground, mostly out over that pasture and along the creek bottom. Some nights, nothing. Some nights, 3, 4 of them at once, just sort of drifting and bobbing. Old Eli Bellhaven, he owned this place back in the 20s. He used to tell people the lights were his wife's spirit. She died young, some kind of fever. After he passed, the stories just kind of grew legs. Now, it's less about Eli's wife and more just general haint stuff. Restless spirits, buried treasure, some folks say. Lights marking where gold's hid, though nobody's ever dug it up. And you believe that? Dale gave her a long, careful look. The look of a man who sold real estate in a small county and had learned not to insult anybody's beliefs out loud. "I believe what I've seen with my own eyes, which is lights I can't explain. What they are, I couldn't tell you. I'll tell you what I do know. It's cost every owner of this place money. Can't hardly hire hands to help with haying past sundown. Trenholms tried running cattle down in that pasture, and half their herd wandered up toward the house every night, like they were spooked off the bottomland. Insurance fella wouldn't even come out and do a walk-through after dark. Made the Trenholms schedule his visit for high noon like he was avoiding vampires." He almost smiled. "It's a fine farm, Ms. Cobb. It's just got a reputation problem is all." Marlene thought about the 14 years she'd spent managing a reputation that was never really hers. Richard's law partners, Richard's parents, Richard's version of who she was supposed to be at dinner parties. She thought about how good it might feel to manage something that was actually, factually, her own problem to solve. "I'll take it," she said, "if you'll come down another 8,000 on the barn roof." Dale laughed for the first time all afternoon. "I believe we can do that." The closing took 11 days. Marlene's sister Denise thought she'd lost her mind. "You're moving to a haunted farm 4 hours from anyone who loves you," Denise said over the phone, in the particular tone she used when she'd already decided the conversation was pointless, but felt obligated to have it anyway. "Alone, in the mountains. Where the cell signal is, 1 bar if you stand on the porch railing? It's not haunted, Denise. It's a rumor. Rumors don't burn through 6 years of listings and 2 prior owners for nothing, Mar. People are afraid of things they don't understand. That's not the same as the thing being real. Richard's already telling people you've had a breakdown." Marlene sat with that for a second, turning it over like a stone she'd picked up off a trail, checking the underside for something crawling. "Let him," she said. "Richard needs a story where I'm the one who broke. It's easier for him than admitting he's the reason there was anything to break." Denise went quiet, which from Denise was as close to an apology as Marlene was going to get, and then said more gently, "Just be careful up there. Not of ghosts. Of being alone somewhere nobody can get to you fast." That part at least Marlene took seriously. She bought a satellite messenger, the kind hikers carried, and hung it by the door. Moving in took 3 weeks of trucks up the switchback drive, and every single delivery driver mentioned the lights within the first 10 minutes of arriving, as though it were an item on a checklist they weren't allowed to skip. The propane tech, filling the tank behind the house, told her his uncle had seen a whole string of them, like Christmas lights strung across the pasture back in '81. The lumber delivery guy, dropping off boards for the barn repair, said his wife wouldn't come up the drive after 6 p.m., even in daylight, because the road itself felt off to her, though he admitted sheepishly that his wife thought a lot of roads felt off. Marlene absorbed all of it with the patient, professional blankness she'd developed over 14 years of Thanksgiving dinners with in-laws who liked to needle. She said things like, "Huh, interesting," and "I'll keep an eye out," and did not, in front of any of them, admit that she'd already seen the lights herself twice and found them beautiful rather than frightening. The trouble started showing its teeth when she tried to hire help. She needed someone to help rebuild the fencing along the low pasture, clear brush from the creek bottom, get the hayfields into shape before the first cutting. She called 4 names off a list the county extension office gave her. 2 never called back after she mentioned the address. A third, a wiry, sun-cured man named Curtis Ray Justice, who did fencing for half the valley, drove up, walked the property with her in broad daylight, quoted a fair price, and then, at the very end, standing at his truck door, asked what time she needed the work finished each day. "Whenever's convenient," Marlene said. "I don't have a hard cutoff." "I mean," Curtis Ray said, not quite meeting her eye, "I need to be off this land by full dark, every day. No exceptions. I got no problem with the work, ma'am. My daddy worked this ground back when the Trenholms had it. Helped with hay one September. And he told me himself, watched 3 lights come up out of that creek bottom like they were rising up out of the water, and one of them came within 40 yards of him before it went out like someone blew a candle. He wasn't a man who scared easy, and it took him a week to sleep right after." "I understand," Marlene said, because it was clear this was not a negotiation. Off by dark. Deal. It cost her 11 extra working days, stretched across a project that should have taken 2 weeks, because Curtis Ray's crew showed up late in the fall light and packed up early, unwilling to push even half an hour past sundown, no matter how close they were to finishing a section. She paid overtime rates for underwhelming hours. She watched money leave her new thin bank account faster than work got done, and she began to understand, in a way that Dale Pruitt's careful warnings hadn't quite conveyed, that this was not a superstition she could simply ignore her way past. It was an operating cost. It touched everything. Labor, insurance, the 2 prospective buyers for hay bales who'd backed out of standing contracts once they heard where the hay came from, the veterinarian who wanted a daylight-only clause written into any future livestock contract before she'd even bought a single cow. The reputation of the land was, functionally, a lien against everything she wanted to build on it. After that first night on the porch, Marlene started documenting. Not because she believed in ghosts, but because she'd learned something from her marriage that she intended never to unlearn. Vague fear thrives in a vacuum of specifics, and specifics are the only thing that ever actually settles an argument. Richard had gotten away with a decade of small cruelties by keeping everything unspoken, undocumented, deniable. She was not going to let a light in a field get away with the same trick. She bought a cheap spiral notebook and a pair of night vision binoculars off the internet, and every night the lights appeared, she wrote down the date, the time, the approximate location, the weather, the barometric pressure. She found a barometer at a flea market in Marlinton, the temperature, and a rough sketch of the light's movement. October 14th. 2 lights, low pasture near the creek bend, appeared 11:40 p.m., bluish-white, moved slowly northeast about 200 yards over 11 minutes, faded rather than went out. Cold snap that day, temperature dropped from 61 to 34 by evening, barometric pressure falling. October 19th. 1 light, same area, briefly split into what looked like 2 smaller flickers before rejoining. Rain earlier that day. Ground saturated. October 27th. Nothing. Clear, dry, high pressure, cold, and still. November 3rd. 3 lights at once, unusually active, moving close to the ground in a way that reminded her of pilot lights on a gas stove. She wrote that comparison down and then stared at it for a long time. By mid-November, she had a pattern forming that no ghost story had ever bothered to notice, because ghost stories aren't interested in barometric pressure. The lights appeared more often after rain. They appeared more often when the pressure was dropping. They almost never appeared on clear, dry, high-pressure nights. They clustered near the creek bottom and the lowest part of the pasture, never up near the house, never on the ridge, never anywhere the ground rose more than a few feet above the creek's floodplain. She thought about swamp gas, the biological decomposition kind, marsh gas, will-o'-the-wisp, the classic explanation for exactly this kind of phenomenon. But there was no actual swamp on the property, no standing water, no cattails or reeds, nothing that looked remotely like wetland, just ordinary hay pasture over what the county soil survey called shaly silt loam, well drained. That didn't fit the textbook explanation at all. And it bothered her the way a math problem that almost balances bothers a person who's good with numbers. She called the county extension office and asked, feeling faintly ridiculous, if anyone there knew anything about the geology of Pocahontas County that might explain lights appearing over dry pasture land. The woman on the phone, whose name was Georgianne, did not laugh at her, which Marlene appreciated more than she expected to. "Honey, half this county sits on old gas-bearing shale," Georgianne said. "You're not the first person to call about lights. You want my honest opinion, and I'm not a geologist, mind you, but I'd get somebody out from the State Geological Survey or one of the gas companies to take a look at your ground. This whole region's got natural gas seeps folks have known about for 200 years, used to call some of them burning springs. There's a whole town in the state name for one. If your land's sitting over a shallow pocket of gas that's finding its way up through fractures in the rock, especially after rain when the ground's saturated and pressure's changing, that gas can seep out, and under the right conditions, it'll ignite on its own contact with air, real low heat, real faint blue flame. People been mistaking that for spirits since before this country had a name." Marlene sat very still, holding the phone, feeling something shift in her chest that she didn't have a word for yet. Not quite triumph, not quite relief. Something more like the specific grounding satisfaction of watching a wobbling table finally sit flat once you've found the short leg. "Can you recommend someone who would actually come look?" "I surely can." His name was Franklin Okafor Reyes, a field geologist with the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey, who specialized, as it turned out, in exactly the kind of shallow biogenic and thermogenic gas seeps that plagued, his word gently used, old farms across the Allegheny Plateau. He drove up on a gray afternoon in late November with a truck full of equipment Marlene didn't recognize. A handheld gas detector, soil probes, a small drill rig for taking shallow core samples, a laptop connected to something that looked like a metal detector's more serious cousin. "Your neighbor Dale mentioned the history," Franklin said, shaking her hand at the porch steps. He had an easy, unhurried manner that made Marlene relax before he'd even started working. Lights over pasture land, low areas, worse after rain. That's about the most textbook description of a shallow gas seep I've heard in 15 years of doing this job. I'm not saying that's definitely what you've got. I don't guess before I've got data, but I'll tell you, I drove up here excited. They spent the better part of 2 days out in the low pasture. Franklin drilled a series of shallow soil probes along the creek bottom and up the slope, testing for methane and other combustible gases at different depths. He walked the fence lines with his gas detector clicking softly, marking spots with little orange flags whenever the reading spiked. By the second afternoon, there were nearly 30 orange flags clustered along a band running roughly parallel to the creek, exactly the area where Marlene's notebook showed the lights concentrating. Here's what I think is happening, and we'll confirm more once I get the core samples analyzed, Franklin said, sitting on the porch steps with a mug of the coffee Marlene had made, his boots caked in the pale creek bottom mud. This whole region sits over Devonian black shale, which is naturally gas-bearing. It's actually part of the same broader formation that's made this state's gas industry what it is for 150 years. Most places, that gas is locked up thousands of feet down, needs serious drilling to get at commercially. But every so often you get a spot where the geology's unusual, a fracture zone, a fold in the rock, some combination of mineral composition and structure that lets gas migrate up close to the surface naturally, along weaknesses in the rock. From what I'm seeing in your soil gas readings and from the flag pattern along that creek bottom, I think you've got exactly that. A shallow seep probably fed by a fracture zone running under the creek. Rain saturates the ground, barometric pressure shifts push gas up through the wet soil and standing puddles along the creek edge, and where methane or a mix of hydrocarbon gases meets the air in the right low concentration, it can spontaneously combust. Very faint, very low temperature, bluish flame. Exactly the kind of thing that's been called will-o'-the-wisp or foxfire or spirit lights in folklore going back centuries, all over the world, long before anybody understood the chemistry. So it's not dangerous, Marlene said. The flame itself, as you've described and documented it, no. It's low concentration, it burns itself out fast, doesn't carry heat far. I wouldn't want you building a bonfire down there on a wet night just to see what happens, but nobody's ever been hurt by these lights in 6 generations of stories, and that tracks with what I'd expect. What I will say is this. He tapped the mug against his knee for emphasis. A shallow seep like this, feeding light strong enough and consistent enough to be documented for 100 years, tells me there's very likely a real gas resource under this property. Might not be huge, might not be commercial by the standards of a big shale play, but it's worth having a legitimate energy company come out and do a proper survey, because what looks like a curse to your neighbors might be sitting on top of an asset. Marlene looked out at the low pasture, gray and quiet under the November clouds, and thought about every dollar Curtis Ray's overtime rates had cost her, every hay contract that had walked away, every worker who wouldn't cross her own fence line after 5 p.m. 6 generations of people were scared of my bank account, she said, half to herself. Franklin laughed, surprised. That might be the best summary of applied geology I've ever heard. Word travels fast in a county where everyone still calls the farm by a family name 3 owners removed from anyone living. Within a week of Franklin's visit, half the valley knew a geologist had been up at Belhaven with soil probes and flags, and the story shifted almost overnight from ghosts to gas, which Marlene noted with some amusement. Some of her neighbors seemed almost disappointed by, the way people sometimes are when a satisfying mystery turns out to have a mundane, load-bearing explanation. Curtis Ray Justice, of all people, was the one who said it best, leaning on his truck the day he came back to finish the last stretch of fence, no longer in any hurry to leave before dark. "My daddy's gonna be almost mad about this," he said. "He's told that story about the light coming up 30 yards off him so many times, it was practically his best material at the diner. Now, it's just gas. Kind of takes the poetry out of it." "Tell him it's ancient poetry," Marlene said. 300 million years old, give or take. Older than the mountains, probably. Curtis Ray considered that. "I'll tell him that. He might like that better, actually." The harder conversations were the ones with energy companies, and Marlene approached them the same way she'd approached the divorce, reading every document twice, hiring her own lawyer instead of trusting anyone else's version of fair, and refusing every offer that smelled even faintly of someone assuming she wouldn't understand the terms. 3 companies came out to survey after Franklin's report became public record through the State Geological Survey's database. 2 offered standard leases that would have handed over broad rights with thin royalties and looser environmental language than she was comfortable with. The third, a mid-sized regional operator called Highland Ridge Energy that specialized in smaller, shallow gas fields exactly like hers, offered something different: a joint development agreement rather than a straight lease, higher royalty percentages in exchange for a smaller drilling footprint, strict water testing requirements written into the contract at her insistence, and a clause guaranteeing restoration of any disturbed pasture land to agricultural use once wells were established and pipe connections buried. She spent 6 weeks negotiating that contract line by line, and when she signed it in February, sitting at the same kitchen table where she'd once stood staring out at lights she didn't understand, she felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the specific, hard-won satisfaction of a decision she'd made entirely on her own terms. The gas money didn't come all at once, and Marlene was careful about that from the start, treating the signing bonus and the early royalty checks the way she'd learned. Too late. She should have treated every dollar in her marriage as something to be planned around rather than assumed. She put a chunk of the signing bonus straight into the barn, which had needed the roof Dale had knocked $8,000 off for in the first place, and into new fencing done properly, without the after-hours restrictions that had cost her so much the first autumn. She hired Curtis Ray full-time through the following spring, no longer worried about daylight cutoffs, and he brought 2 of his cousins on to help clear and improve pasture land that hadn't been properly managed in over a decade. By the following summer, the low pasture, the same ground that had scared off cattle and hay buyers and insurance adjusters for 6 years, had been reseeded, cross-fenced into rotational grazing paddocks, and was carrying 40 head of beef cattle that Marlene had bought at auction in Lewisburg. Animals that grazed contentedly within sight of the very spot where blue lights still occasionally rose on wet, low-pressure nights, utterly unbothered, because cattle, it turned out, startle at plenty of things, but apparently not at 300-million-year-old methane. She modernized the well system with the help of a hydrologist Franklin recommended, protecting her water from any possibility of contamination as the gas wells went in, and insisted on independent water testing every quarter, paid for out of her own royalty income, rather than trusting Highland Ridge's word alone, a habit that would have struck her 3 years earlier as paranoid, and now simply struck her as competent. She rebuilt the farmhouse kitchen herself mostly, with a contractor for the parts that mattered, and her own hands for everything else, tearing down the peeling wallpaper that had always looked, in her opinion, like it was trying to leave, and replacing it with plain painted plaster, the color of the creek bottom in October light. And she kept the notebook, not because she needed it anymore. Franklin's report and the drilling logs from Highland Ridge had long since turned her amateur barometric pressure sketches into a footnote in a much more thorough scientific record, but because it had been the first thing on this farm that was entirely hers. Her observations, her questions, her refusal to accept haunted as a stopping point when there was clearly more to learn. On a clear October evening, 2 years almost to the day since she'd first walked the property with Dale Pruitt, Marlene stood on her rebuilt porch with a glass of wine from a bottle a neighbor had brought over. The same neighbors who'd once told delivery drivers to warn her about the ghost light farm now brought her canning and stayed for supper and watched the low pasture where 40 cattle grazed peacefully in the last gold light of day. Dale had come by that afternoon with a young couple looking at a smaller parcel 2 farms over, and he'd pointed across the valley toward Marlene's place, telling them, unprompted, "See that farm there? Used to be nobody'd touch it. Called it haunted for 100 years. Woman bought it a couple years back, turned out to be sitting on a real nice little gas pocket, and now look at it. Best run cattle operation in 3 miles. Funny how that goes." Marlene had laughed when he told her that story later over coffee, not because it was wrong, but because of how neatly it had already folded her whole ordeal. The divorce, the lonely drive up the mountain with a satellite messenger hung by the door, the notebook full of barometric pressure readings, the months of Curtis Ray's overtime bills, and the neighbors' careful, fearful warnings, into a single tidy sentence that made it sound almost easy. Turned out to be sitting on a real nice little gas pocket, as if she hadn't had to insist alone in a lawyer's office and a geologist's field notes and a contract negotiation that lasted 6 weeks, that the story about her land, and by extension the story about her, deserved a more careful telling than the frightened second-hand version everyone had been so quick to settle for. That night, as she often did now out of habit more than necessity, Marlene watched the low pasture until, just after 11, a single faint blue-white light rose slow and quiet from the creek bottom, drifted perhaps 60 yards north across the dark grass, and faded out on its own, the way it always had, the way it probably always would, long after anyone currently alive had stopped being frightened of it or explaining it or writing it down. She raised her glass to it, the way you might toast an old, difficult friend who'd finally told you the truth. 300 million years old, she said quietly to no one, and it took you this long to tell anybody what you actually were. Down in the pasture, the cattle shifted and settled, unbothered, and the ridgeline went on holding up the sky the way it had since long before anyone thought to be afraid of it.